standards.
So,
Oh.
so
no, yeah.
it's I should introduce old friend, not just mine, but of the institute, who's at Columbia, and very interesting paper. So
Thank you. Thank you, Anand, and thank you everyone for coming. It's nice to have some in-person audience, otherwise it's a bit strange. This is Rajiv Sethi, who I think most people know. Oh, yeah. Okay, so the paper is about meritocracy, and in sort of popular usage, the standard conception of meritocracy, most people, if you ask them to define it, will come up with something along the following lines that that whatever selection practices you have, whether it's selection into education institutions, selection into jobs, should be increasing in measures of past performance, like test scores, academic performance, GPA, so on and so forth, and should be contingent only on productive traits. So if membership of a particular group is not itself a productive trait, maybe for some purposes, but if it's not a productive trait for the purpose for which you're selecting people, then your selection practice should be blind to the group identity. Now, this doesn't mean that the selection should be blind to group identity, but you can have other arguments, or non-meritocratic arguments, to have group contingent selection practices. I'm still describing the conventional wisdom here, which I'm going to challenge. But there's a trade-off involved that you lose something on the meritocratic dimension if you try to increase, let's say, representation, your targets and so on. That's conventional wisdom. Right? The situation is a bit more complicated than that. In particular, because past performance is a government signal of whatever it is that you're trying to predict. You're trying to predict that somebody's going to do well, let's say, either in an academic institution, maybe later in life. In the United States context, universities admitting people and would like to get people who will end up on the Supreme Court or will end up, in high office, develop a vaccine, run a build and run a corporation, whatever it might be, whatever their goals may be. But the past performance at the time at which they're making selection is a very, very noisy signal of whatever it is that they're trying to optimize with respect to performance. And because it's noisy, then group membership can be informative, that the meaning of that signal, right, the past performance can differ in a way that's group contingent. That's pretty self-evident, I think. But what I want to first show you is that it can vary in a way that even within groups gives you non-monotonic selection, in that you don't necessarily want to have a threshold rule where you say, okay, here's a cutoff score, I take everybody above and I leave everybody below, because there may be segments of that score distribution which are very promising for that future performance, and they may not lie adjacent to the top of that distribution. So that's one of the arguments that I and so what the paper does, under what conditions would monotonic and group bias selection actually maximize performance, if that's what you're going to do. So we set aside all non-performance motives, like representation, like justice, like, and suppose that, all you care about is performance. Are you going to then adopt what is, under conventional wisdom, a meritocratic principle, which is basically a threshold rule? You look at performance-related measures of past performance, identify a threshold based on how many people you want to admit, and you take people above, you reject people below, right? That's the kind of thing. Is that going to really maximize performance? Maybe it will, maybe it won't. Under what conditions will it? When it does not, then what does performance maximizing selection look like? Can a disadvantaged group, for example, be overrepresented if performance is the only goal? If you're not motivated by justice and you're not motivated by representation, can you still have overrepresentation of a group that is disadvantaged? And I define disadvantage, but disadvantage in this case means that under that sort of quasi-meritocratic selection rule, the monotonic group line selection rule, that group would be underrepresented, right? That's what we mean by disadvantaged, effectively. Right? You'll see more precisely. What are the effects of allowing for underreporting or underinvestment? And you'll see, when you have non-monotonicity, there's incentives for underreporting your past performance. If it can increase your chances of selection, and what happens then in equilibrium, right? When people do that. And what are the effects of allowing for commitment? So if you can commit to a particular selection policy and stick to it ahead of time, how does that affect the problem? So those are the basic questions that we're looking at. Yeah.
So saying that performance is monotonic in some major margin,
yeah,
and saying that there is a threshold rule, are the equivalent statements?
No, that's one of the main points that I want to leave you. Yeah, no, they're not at all equivalent, actually. Yeah, you'll see that in a well-defined sense, that other things equal, higher past performance predicts better future performance. But when other things are not equal and there's uncertainty, that need not be the case, actually. Yes. Yeah. So I'll show you some examples, very simple examples. Just, I don't know, I find this kind of thing really interesting. Maybe you don't, this is sort of a bit of a diversion from the theory, but the origin of the term meritocracy was in the 1950s. Michael Young wrote this book called The Rise of Meritocracy. Somebody, a British socialist called Alan Fox actually used the term 2 years previous to that, but he may have seen an earlier draft of, who knows, who invented the term. But basically it was disparaging, it was really insulting. It was, the term meritocracy was used in a way to describe a system that was poorly designed in a sense. And we'll see some arguments along those lines later. But it has transformed over time into something that's, many politicians all over the world, will say this is what we must aspire to, and so on and so forth. So it has an interesting history. And in the US context, I mean, this may be less, less interest to you than maybe a US audience, but there's a very interesting exchange of letters between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams in 1813, sorry. And the idea of what we call meritocracy is what Thomas Jefferson called natural aristocracy. And he argued that we want to implement in the United States a natural aristocracy based on virtue and talents, rather than an artificial aristocracy founded on wealth and birth. And he advocated a very well-funded system of public education, including at the university level, where worth and genius could be sought out from every condition of life, and basically prepared by education for defeating the competition of wealth and birth for public trust. So government, this is the essence of the meritocratic ideal by Jefferson. And John Adams was very cynical about this and responded by basically saying that once you have any kind of elite, it will entrench itself, that you're not going to be able to achieve your natural aristocracy. And in his usual flowery language, he said, aristocracy, like waterfire, dives for ladies and rises with brighter plumage, etc., etc. It's a phoenix that rises again out of its own ashes. So this debate is actually very contemporary, about whether once you set up a system, whether the meritocracy will actually just reproduce what Jefferson called artificial aristocracy. Anyway, that's a digression. I'll come back to these issues in a little later. And part of the mechanism by which people who have achieved an elite status might replicate themselves is by shaping the understanding of meritocracy, to convince people that they're actually achieving their status through meritocratic means. And that's really the connection to the more theoretical part of the paper. But we can come back to this point. So that's why that. I want to just talk about 3 empirical findings, because I don't know if they're applied micro people here, because I find these 3 papers that they came out in the last couple of years. One is not yet published, and I find them fascinating. And I just want to, this is the empirical motivation for what we're doing, even though part of the theory precedes my knowledge of these papers. These are very recent papers. So one paper, this job market paper by Ursina Scheger from Zurich, and she did this work with this Finnish education researcher, Manke. And basically what they had, in Finland, out of all the countries in the world, the prestige associated to teachers is the highest probably, or among the highest. And they have, graduate degrees at the master's level to train people to go and teach in classrooms, elementary school children, high school children, and so on. And this is very competitive, very, and the salaries are very high, once you graduate from here, lots of applications, lots of rejections. So it's a very competitive, field in Finland. And so they reject a lot of people. And they used to have a quota in Finland for several years, where at least 40%, so they have a 2-stage process. The first stage is just based on roughly test score. You have to meet a test score threshold to get into the second stage. Second stage is much more practical, classroom observation and so on and so on. And on the first stage, they used to have a quota which said that, you're going to choose test scores thresholds separate for men and women, such that you get at least 40% male, moving on to the second stage. So, had you not done that, the male population of teachers would have been lower. Right? So this was a binding constraint. And so males, in effect, got selected with lower scores than women prior, when the quota was in place. Quota was then removed, so that you have something approximating what people would think of as a meritocratic system now. And this was done in the 1990s, so they tracked these people, into the labor market. These children, who are exposed to these teachers. So you have children who are exposed to teachers who came in under the quota system, children who are exposed to teachers who came in after the quota system. And I won't go into identification strategy, the variation across, retirements, cause variation across space in how many new teachers are recruited and so on. Yeah, they take care of those kind of issues. And they find remarkably that students exposed to the teachers after quota removal had lower job market performance, educational attainment, and labor market performance than people exposed to quota people. And what's more interesting than that, actually, is that it was not the quality of being male that was causing this effect, actually. So they rule out things like, well, not exactly rule out, but they provide evidence to suggest that it's not complementarities, that when you have a mix of men and women, the children do better. That's not what's going on, because the effect was the same whether you had an initially highly skewed gender composition or not. And then they rule out things about role model effects, because the girls actually benefit just as much as the boys, from this thing. So they rule out, some of the obvious explanations for this. And what I want to argue here is really what's going on is that the males in their sample had different unobservable characteristics, and that the existence of the quota was picking performance-related characteristics that you couldn't take otherwise without the quota, because because they were unobservable, and what the quota was effectively doing. And part of the reason is that the males were skewed rural, actually. And so, given any test score, people coming from rural areas or people who had not moved from a particular area, and those were differences between male and female applicants, conditional on a test score were predictive of higher performance. What is higher performance in this case is how well the children do, right? The children that you're teaching in the classroom. Fascinating study, actually. I mean, the applied micro people will look at all the identification issues and so on and so forth, but it's an interesting. Very briefly, Sandy Black, my colleague at Columbia, Benning and Rothstein, they looked at this thing, the Texas 10% policy. Again, I won't go into that in detail, but basically Texas imposed a policy whereby if you were in the top 10% of your high school, no matter how bad the high school, you were automatically admitted to the flagship campus of the University of Texas at Austin, right? If you wanted to go there, automatically, and this is, you would think, is anti-meritocratic. It imposes a constraint on the admissions committee to admit anybody who's in the top 10% of their class, no matter what their test scores, no matter what they've done academically, they just happen to beat the other people that they're in school with. And they find that, they consider this paradoxical, but they find that policy introduced for equity reasons also seem to have improved efficiency. What do they mean by this? They are, again, very creatively, this is, first-rate empirical researchers, they identify pulled-in students, people who are pulled in by the policy who would not have been admitted had it not been in place, and those who are pushed out, those who would have been admitted after the policy was implemented, but who are not admitted after the policy is implemented, but would have been admitted under the previous unconstrained policy. And again, similar effects to Cheda and Mackey, right? You impose the 10% policy, and you get these pulled-in students who do extremely well relative to those who are pushed out, who don't seem to suffer that much, actually. So there's an efficiency gain from a policy that was not designed for efficiency at all. And then Lima, there was a ban on affirmative action in California, and it led to significant education and wage costs for the students who were pushed out. They pushed into less selective institutions, away from Berkeley and UCLA and so on, into Riverside and other institutions. But the gains for the on-the-margin beneficiaries of the ban, the people who got admitted because of the removal of the ban, appear to have been very modest or negligible, actually. So again, you get these efficiency gains from policy that's really not about efficiency. So, and I want to argue that this makes sense that this sort of meritocratic benchmark that I started off with is not actually performance maximizing. So you shouldn't really be surprised by these findings based on the model that I'm going to present. That's the motivation. Let me just stick through this. I'll just stick through that because I want to get through. We are finishing at what time?
12:45, but
oh, 12:45, so there's another hour left.
Yeah.
Oh, then I'll show you this thing from. This is another interesting paper. It's also mostly empirical, but they also look at selection to a gifted program for children, and they don't name it for privacy reasons. But basically, what they say is that if you've got different groups and you choose different thresholds of admission for these groups, I'm going to argue that threshold type policies are themselves not necessarily performance maximizing. But what they argue is that even if you have threshold type policy, you don't necessarily want to apply the same threshold to different groups. And the argument is that there may be groups that systematically experience more hardship. In that case, the meaning of a score is different for those groups. And so therefore, by taking this into account, you may be able to select people who are more gifted in whatever sense you're trying to identify. And this is what they call profiling. But they say it's not preferential treatment because what you're just trying to do is to maximize performance, to identify the most gifted. You're using information about group membership, but not in order to favor the group, right? So this is not preferential treatment. You're doing it on the basis of some other objective. That is group neutral. That is neutral to group dimension. Okay, so let me get into the model. And what I'll do is I'll just present, I think for the most part, a really simple 2x2 version of this model, and then go into some of the extensions, with continuous ability distributions and so on. But I think the basic ideas should be clear in this 2x2 case, and hopefully we'll communicate enough, to get some feedback and some discussion. Okay, so think about a population of individuals, and they differ along 2 dimensions, and we're going to call those dimensions ability and resources. And ability should be defined broadly. You should think of ability as defined broadly. It should include not just things like, proficiency with regard to test performance, but also things like what in the US has been found to be very predictive of performance, which is things like grit, determination, willingness to not give up. So this is all wrapped into ability. So think of ability more broadly than sort of IQ, which is sort of what people think of traditionally with regard to ability. It's something that is earlier positively related to performance. Subsequently, other things equal. Okay. And then think about resources. So resources would be, sort of investment in tutoring. This is a huge industry. I understand, in India, in East Asia more generally, also in the United States. But just, you can invest resources to increase people's performance. Let's say on some measure. Think of it as a test score, if you like. And that increase, I don't want you to think of it as a fake increase. That investment in somebody to improve the test scores is itself productive, in the sense that what you're doing, whatever it is that you're doing, its primary goal may be to improve scores so that you are selected with greater likelihood. But it also has a secondary effect of teaching you things that are going to be valuable and increase your performance in the future. And that's why we don't call it a test score, we call it training, right? So what the resources are doing are increasing your level of training, and that's going to be visible, that's going to be observable. You can think of it as a test score if you like, but again, think of it broadly. It's some sort of measure of achievement, and that achievement is actually productive, right? Other things equal, people with higher training will be more productive in the future. But there are 2 dimensions, and they're not independently observable. You observe the training, but your level of training depends on ability and resources both, which are not independently observable. That's the setup. It's a very simple departure from standard human capital models, but it's one that I don't think, at least as far as we know, exists in the literature, and it makes a huge difference, actually. Just a little tweak. And basically,
so what's the tweak?
I'll tell you what the tweak is. The tweak is that for your performance, okay, this is the tweak relative to standard human capital models. So your performance later in life, right, in the academic setting or beyond, depends on your training, right? Your training coming in, but it depends also independently on your ability. So the tweak is that ability affects your future performance through 2 channels. One, it affects your training, which is observable, and on the basis of which selection can take place. And 2, conditional on training, people of high ability are going to do better in the future. That's it. Yeah.
And in the standard models, what do they have?
In the standard model, in a lot of the literature, the training is a sufficient statistic for future performance. So any effect of ability on future performance is absorbed and incorporated into the training, for example. So that's a lot of the colorblind affirmative action literature, for example, the Chan and Eister and so on and so forth. That basically a lot of the traditional models have productivity to be observable. Once you have productivity or performance observable, there's no inference problem at all.
Oh, but then the entire statistical discrimination.
Correct. So statistical discrimination literature, yes, statistical discrimination literature does allow, and in fact, it's fundamental in that literature that the interpretation of a score is group contingent. That's correct. Yeah, that's correct.
So that's already there. What's it? You're doing something else. What is it?
Maybe we can come back to it in a bit. What the statistical discrimination literature has. Let me come back to its own. Statistical discrimination literature has threshold policies being optimal. And one of the first things I'm going to show you is the threshold policy in this case is not optimal. And so clearly there's something different, but let me come back to it instead of trying to think on my feet right now. Yeah, it's discussed in the paper a bit, but definitely there's some, these assumptions deviate to some degree from statistical discrimination. Yeah. Okay, so this is
how does ability affect change? I mean, is it like signaling type stuff in which high ability people are able to acquire these more easily?
Yeah. So high ability people are able to acquire training with lower resources.
With lower cost.
Yeah, with lower cost, yeah. It's like that, yeah, it's a bit like that. Except that in the signaling models like Spence, the training is actually unproductive. All you care about is so you're trying to just make an inference about it. Yeah. So but here the training is productive, which actually has going to have some efficiency implications. You actually want to get people with higher training, right? Even if they have lower ability than people with lower training under certain conditions. Now, to give you an example, if suppose that somebody is, absolutely brilliant, but has not managed to get resources even to achieve basic literacy and numeracy. You don't want that person, even if you have got somebody who's lower ability, but has actually achieved basic training. Yeah. I mean, this is, I think, empirically pretty recent. Okay, and then you have got groups. I'm going to talk about two groups, and they differ with regard to their resource distributions, but not with regard to their ability distribution. So that's just what Glenn Lowry calls the axiom of anti-essentialism. We're going to assume that that's not something that's necessarily empirically verifiable, but that's because ability is not observed. But that's the assumption we're trying to operate. Okay, so what's the optimal selection policy? And then what if people can underinvest or underreport their training levels? And what if a commitment is possible? We're going to look at this question. And I'm just going to do it mostly in this sort of simple 2x2 case. A 2x2 case where there's only 2 resource levels and 2 ability levels. And basically the logic of the argument is transparent in that situation. There's some limitations because if you've got a discrete model like this, 2x2, then training actually does reveal ability and resources. There is no inference problem actually. To move beyond that, you need sort of something like a continuous ability distribution, or you need a mapping that where the training could come from different combinations of ability and resources. And I'll get to that as a generalization, but the basic idea actually here, and that's another difference with statistical discrimination literature. Actually, you can actually make every inference you want about the underlying ability and resources, and still you get the results that I'm going to show you. So 2 ability distributions, two ability levels, a common ability distribution across the 2 groups, 2 resource levels, low and high, and the proportion with high resource in group 1 is Qi. So you have Q1 and Q2, and we're going to assume that Q1 is less than Q2. I'll get to that. So Q1 is less than Q2, meaning the proportion of people with high resources in group 1 is less than the proportion of people with high resources in group 2. And I'll call group 1 disadvantaged. That's the meaning of disadvantage. You have lower resources on average, but of course you have got people with high resources in both groups, people with high resources in low resources in both groups, high ability in both groups, low ability in both groups, but the distributions are different. Right? So one group has fewer high resource people. That's the only difference.
Resource is not a choice.
No, not a choice. No. Okay, so the training T, we use T to training. The training is upper bounded by some function tau, which depends on ability and resources, and it's increasing in both arguments. So conditional on resources, high ability will get a higher training. Conditional on ability, high resource will get higher. Right? So you get, so you've got this function, and that's your upper bound, your training level. You could underperform, and you may want to underperform under certain conditions, and we'll get to that. But that's your limit. The limit is set by your ability and resources, the combination of the 2. Okay? And everything's increasing. There's no rabbit in the hat over here in terms of non-monotonicity. Everything's monotonic. Right? More resources, more training, give you more. More resources, more ability, give you more.
Someone has higher ability, training than someone who has lower.
If somebody's got high ability, he will end up with higher training. At least the upper bound of training will be higher, conditional on resources. If 2 people have the same resources, yeah. High ability gives you higher training, conditional on resources. Yeah.
So how should we think about this training? Is it like a test?
Yeah, you can think about it as a test score, but I actually, any kind of measure of past performance, you can think of a sort of an application package to a university or to a job employer. Yeah, it's just some measure of past performance, GPAs, grades in class, whatever. Okay, now performance. Performance depends on training as well as ability, again, monotonically, right? So high ability will give you high performance future, conditional on selection, and higher training does as well. Training is productive, right? That's one difference with the Spence model. So these are also increasing. So again, everything's monotonic, right? In terms of assumptions, as you would expect. Okay, now you have a population, a continuum population, and you're going to make a selection, and you're going to select a proportion of that population, which we denote by K, and we call that elite capacity. So it's an elite institution, right? Think of an education institution, if you like, or a desired occupation or a job. And K is the proportion of this population that are going to be selected, and that's going to be a key parameter actually. What's going to happen will depend very much on whether you're selecting a very tiny sliver of this population, or you're selecting a relatively large chunk of it. Right? So that's your elite capacity. That's the proportion of the population that's going to be selected. Okay, so now let's take a benchmark where your training is just the maximum attainable. So you don't under invest in training. So you just achieve the most that you can achieve given your ability and resources. So T is equal to its upper bound, which is given by tau of so no under investment.
So like there is no restriction on what the compost, the proportion of these groups is.
I didn't really hear the question.
These two groups.
Yeah, there are two groups.
So there is no restriction on the proportion of these groups.
No, there's no restriction on the proportion of these groups at this point. Yeah, it will play a role. It will interact with the elite capacity. Yeah. What's going to happen will depend on that, but I'm not restricting it in any way. Yeah. I'll give you an example where they're equal, but they don't have to be. But one thing I didn't mention, which is important, is that group membership is observable. So what you observe is group membership. So you can condition on it, right? In fact, that's part of the point of the paper. And you can condition on training. You can't condition on ability or resources. They're not observable independently. Okay, so your benchmark without underinvestment. Now there's going to be 4 training levels. So people with high ability, high resources will get the top training level, THH. People with low ability, low resources will get the lowest training level, TLL. And people with high ability, low resources, or low ability, high resources, they'll have intermediate training levels. And everything depends on how these 2 intermediate training levels are ranked. Right? This is going to be really critical. So it is entirely possible if resources are really matter a lot in terms of how you get training, then people with low ability, high resource may get a higher training level than people with high ability, low resource. But if ability matters much more to get training, that inequality could be reversed. But you can easily imagine situations where these 2 things, the intermediate training levels, could be ranked in either way. I don't think it's a priori necessarily the case that they should be ranked in a particular way. Now you may want to design tests. You may want to define training or design training institutions to get them to fall in a particular way. For example, to seek out high ability people and so on. But right now all of that is exogenous. There's some function that maps ability and resources into training. If ability matters a lot for training, then high ability, low resource will get a higher training level. And if resources matter a lot for training, right, if you can invest in your child, for example, put a lot of resources, tutors, and so on, and push up the training level, then low ability, high training. So read the subscripts as ability first, then training. So low ability, high training, maybe above or below high ability, low training. Low ability, high resources, they give you a training level that is higher or lower than high ability, low resources. Sorry. Performance depends on the resource level
Why?
via training.
Yeah, so indirectly, right?
Indirectly, yeah, indirectly. Could performance depend, in addition to depending independently on ability, should I include resources over here? I think it is implicitly there because I only need to add one argument. I mean, if resources affect future performance, Suppose that I were to have, I'm not 100% certain about this, but maybe somebody here can actually answer. Adding resources here as an independent argument, I think is redundant actually. I think any such function can be expressed as a function of these two because resources are entering training. You just change the phi function. I think there will be an isomorphism, but I'm not 100% sure about that.
That would be for event also, right? This will be.
No. You need at least one. I could drop ability and just put resources. I could drop ability and just put resources here, right? In that case, I would want it to be negative on resources. Holding constant training, right? My future performance depends negatively on resources because the condition on training, the more resources I have, the less ability I have. Yeah, so I could replace A with R, and then I would switch the sign of the relationship. Yeah. So I don't think there's loss of generality leaving out R. But we can come back to that. I haven't been asked that question before, so I'm just thinking on my feet. So that could be wrong, but I think that's right. Okay. Okay, so let's think about
So given the model, you now get a solution on this.
yes, yeah, exactly. So with the proportion in each group, once if you know the proportion in each group, you know QI, proportion with high ability in each group. If you know F, the distribution of probability, then you get a probability distribution of these four things. That is exactly right. In fact, I'll give you an example that shows it visually. Yeah, exactly right. So given the primitives of the model, you'll end up with the distribution of these four training levels. That's exactly right. And then given your lead capacity, you'll pick from that distribution. Exactly right. Yeah. You're like 2 steps ahead. It'll be it. Okay, so I just want to talk about two types of monotonicity. So inference monotonicity, and this is something that's been discussed in the literature. So that you get inference monotonicity, higher levels of training signal higher ability. So basically, to get inference monotonicity, this is low ability, high training. This is high ability, low training. If this THL is above TLH, then you have inference monotonicity. That means if you look at, obviously these people over here, obviously, all right, I'll just use my hand. The people at the top, THH, obviously have higher ability than these folks. Low, better. But what about these two, right? If the ranking is such that high ability, low resource gets a higher training level than low ability, high resource, then you have inference monotonicity. That's the definition of inference monotonicity. Right? That means that if you look at the training levels, right, the lowest training level is low ability, then the next one is also low ability, then you have high ability, then you have high ability. Okay, that's inference monotonicity. If that fails, you have non-monotonicity. Okay. What about performance monotonicity? Even if inference monotonicity fails, so even if it is the case that people with high ability, low resource get a higher score or higher training than people with low ability, high resource, the people with low ability, high resource, I'm sorry, let me say that again. Even if you have inference monotonicity fails to hold, right? If inference monotonicity fails to hold, that means the people with low ability, high resource have a higher score than high ability, low resource, right? Even then, these people with the higher score may be more productive because training is productive. And in that case, you have what we call performance monotonicity. So performance monotonicity can hold even if inference monotonicity fails. And that's kind of obvious if you think about the real world. I mean, this is the example I gave you about the person who would have been a brilliant Nobel Prize winning physicist, but did not even acquire the ability to read or write. If you're going to admit into a physics PhD program, you will not select them because the training matters too much. And so you may still prefer somebody with lower ability if you could observe ability. That's what it means. So formally, if you get inference monotonicity, high ability, low resource gets you a higher training level. So if you get this, then inference monotonicity holds. And then of course you have performance monotonicity, right? Because this person up here not only has a higher training level, they also have high ability. performance depends on ability and training, so obviously performance monitoring is equal, right? However, if this fails, so if high ability low resource has a lower score, right, then you can have performance monitoring equal or not, right? This inequality with regard to performance can go either way. You may or may not, if you only care about performance, you may or may not want to try to get the person with high ability and low resource, even though they have a lower score, relative to the person with low ability and resource. It all depends on how much ability and training matter in determining performance. If inference monotonicity fails. So that's the basic structure. And if performance monotonicity fails, then you're going to have non-monotonic selection in this baseline model. Remember, baseline model, there's no underinvestment, no underreporting of scores or training, and so on. So in this case, if performance monotonicity fails, then you want to take the people at the top, the one with the highest score. I'm just going to call it a score. I think it's just easier to conceptualize. You want to take the THH. You want to take those people with the highest training levels. You take those. But if your elite capacity is large enough that you need more, you'll skip the second training level, move to the third, and you'll pick those because those are high ability, low resource types who will perform better than the low ability, high resource types who are getting higher scores. That's the basic idea. Okay. So now let's take an example actually, exactly what Devasis you were referring to and you were referencing with your population proportions. So suppose that inference monotonicity fails. So low ability, high resource gets you a higher score, right? So you have higher training. And suppose performance monotonicity also fails. So people with high ability and the corresponding score having low resources. People with high ability, low resources will have this score, right? And they'll have high ability. So, and their performance, suppose, is above those with low ability and high resources. Okay. So both inference and performance monotonicity fail. Population shares are 1/2 each. 70% of the population is low ability in both groups. 10% of the disadvantaged group has high resource. 30% of the advantaged group has high resource. So both groups, majority have low resource. Elite capacity is 10%. Performance maximizing selection policy. Obviously, you're going to accept everybody with the highest score, right? But how many people have the highest score actually? Well, you're going to have high ability is 30%, right? So 30%, so 3% of one group and 27% of the other group, right? No, 9% of the other group, right? Sorry. So the high ability is 30%, right? So you get 3% and 9%, right? Basically, of each group will fall into that high category. Each group has got equal size. So basically, what does that mean? I think 6% probably. 6% of the population is going to be with these high scores. Most of them will be in the advantage group, right? So, out of your 6% of the population that have the highest scores, right? 4.5% of that will come from the advantage group. 1.5% of that will come from the disadvantage group, right? But you take those, but that just fills up 6%. You want another 4%. Where is this other 4% going to come from? So here's the baseline. So this is the example that I just gave you. Basically, this is 1.5% of the total population. This is 4.5% of the total population. This is the advantage group at the bottom. Okay. So as you said, you're going to get a distribution of the T's, but you get group contingent. So this distribution is more skewed to the left than this distribution. This is the disadvantaged group. You have a lot more people with the lowest score because they have low resources, and you get fewer people at the top, right? And in this group, you get more people at the top. So out of the total population, 4.5% here, 1.5% here, that's your 6%. Where do you take the rest from? Well, because performance monotonicity fails, these people here are actually more productive in terms of your performance. You want to get the high ability, low resource types, and they happen to have lower scores than the low ability, high resource types in this example. So you jump over these, that's going to give you an incentive to underinvest. but we'll deal with that. Right now, just assume that they have some consumption benefit from getting the highest possible score. You skip over those people, and then you're going to choose. And one way to choose is just uniformly random from the people at this score level. Okay, that selection policy is group blind. You're not distinguishing between the groups at all, but it's not monotonic. Right? Okay, good. Now, this
Is group important in this argument?
not yet, but just give me 1 minute. The group will be critically important. Just give me 1 minute. Now, these people would like to be selected. They can achieve this level of training. It is within their capacity. Their level of training is upper bounded by this. Right? But they could pool with the people who are being selected. Right? They could just choose a lower training level, pool with the people who are being selected, and they increase the likelihood of selection. These people are being selected with some probability to fill up the remaining 4% of elite capacity. Well, if these people pool down, choose lower level of ability, they join that pool, they become indistinguishable. You still got to get your 4% of capacity. So now they have increased their chances of selection. So they have an incentive.
Group pool composition.
Exactly. But when these people pool here and these people pool here, this group is suddenly of much higher quality. It has more people of high ability or resource, which we are assuming is more productive. Right? The group composition. And so in that case, what you do is you take your entire 4% from here. Right? You take your 6% from the people with the highest scores, but now you take everybody from the disadvantaged group, because the disadvantaged pool is of higher quality. The ratio of the more productive to less productive is better in the disadvantaged group, right? Because they have gotten those training levels. They are more likely to have gotten those training levels with high ability, low resource, than with low ability, high resource, and underinvestment.
So the case where performance monotonicity fails.
This is the case where performance monotonicity fails. If performance monotonicity does not fail, then a group blind monotonic selection policy will be an equilibrium policy, because any monotonic selection policy has no incentive to underinvest. Yeah. So that case is actually straightforward.
So what you're saying is, if performance monotonicity fails, then meritocratic policies, they will induce people to change their training.
It depends. I haven't completed the argument yet, because I don't like this underinvestment. The underinvestment involves an efficiency loss. Training is productive. So the fact that people are underinvesting in training is actually efficiency, it's costly. And I would rather design a system where they don't do that. And I can design such a system by having a monotonic selection policy. Right? And so I will do that, I'll get to that. But I can only do that if I have commitment. If I don't have commitment, I can't, because if I announce a monotonic policy and I can go back on it, I will go back on it. Right? If people choose the training levels consistent with their maximum, then you're back in the baseline case, and then I don't want to stick to my monotonic policy. So under commitment, or only under commitment can I do better than this. This is not a good outcome, in the sense that you've got waste. You've got productive training that's not being achieved, right? But immediately, as Som pointed out right away, immediately you flip. You have a strict preference for the people from a disadvantaged group, because the group composition is different. Okay. And all of this is coming from this little tweak in the human capital assumptions. And you don't have this in the statistical discrimination. Now, why exactly you don't have it, or whether there is something, I don't know. But yeah.
So group seems to matter. Second stage, that's because in the first stage, people, less amount of patient people were highlighted, people were selected.
Not quite. So not quite. It's not that less amount of HS people were selected in the first stage. That's not really the key thing. The key thing is, among those who were not selected but did not have the lowest score, so among those who had intermediate scores, right, a greater proportion had high ability in the disadvantaged group than in the second one. Even if I change this distribution, so this distribution is coming from a certain model, but even if I change this distribution and make this equal to that, right? So 4.5% here, 4.5% here, and I just remove some people from here. That still gives me only 9%. I still need 1% more. I would still prefer the disadvantaged group. So it's not the fact that they're underrepresented among the top that's driving what's going on. It's that they're more productive among the intermediate.
Yeah, so essentially among the high people, less of the high people.
That's right. If that's what you were saying, then I indicated. That's right. Among the high ability people, that's right.
Yeah.
A smaller proportion have high enough resources to achieve the top score. And so therefore they end up achieving something lower. And that's what drives the pool composition effect that Som saw right away. Yeah.
So that's why in the second round, the group seems to matter. But if elite capacity is too low.
Yeah, if elite capacity is too low, then even if performance monotonicity fails, you will have monotonic group blind selection. Yes. If an elite capacity in this example is less than 6%, then you just take the top people and forget everybody else. Then no problem. And that's worth thinking about. So there may be certain institutions that are picking such a small sliver of the population that these effects are not relevant. And I believe that that's the case. There will be. That will be the case. So it just really depends on what kind of application you have in mind. The point is that there may be applications for which this is relevant, but definitely it will not be relevant for all applications. In particular, if elite capacity is very, very small, may not be relevant. This argument may not be relevant. Now you may have other arguments that cause you to, adjust your selection policies. But the whole point is that meritocracy is not obvious. The point is that, what is meritocratic? We are just assuming performance maximized. And you get this sort of, you're getting away from monotonicity here, and you're getting away from group blindness here. Right? Okay, how do we deal now with the problem that underinvestment is inefficient? If you can commit to a policy, very simple. You just commit to a policy that is weakly monotonic, and you basically say, if you are in this intermediate score level, I apply the same probability of selection to you. Right? So I shouldn't look at this diagram, I should look here. I just say, look, if you are in this intermediate score level, right, I apply the same probability to you, and so you might as well not underinvest. Right? Just go ahead and invest whatever you want. I will treat you as if you had the lowest score that you would report to me if you were underinvested. In both groups, I'll treat you the same at these two intermediate score levels. Okay? You commit to that policy. If you commit to that policy, then there's no incentive to underinvest. You'll be treated the same if you underinvest than if you don't underinvest. Okay? However, it doesn't remove the group blindness effect. In fact, you will treat those two levels the same, and that same will be zero probability of selection. And you will treat the disadvantaged group two training levels the same, and that level will be non-zero. So you will pick uniformly at random from, and that's the commitment case, from the intermediate training levels. You treat them the same, even though you know that you'd rather have the ones with the, high ability, low resources. But if you were to do that, you'd end up with a waste. You'd end up with a less productive pool, selected pool. So you'd rather commit than not commit. Yeah. If you can commit, you'd rather commit. And you end up basically selecting the same population. Right? It's just that you pool for them instead of forcing them to pool, which is more efficient. So that's basically the idea. Everything else is like bells and whistles. I mean, let me just continue with this. Actually, no, sorry. I take that back. This is one type of equilibrium. I think in some ways it's the more interesting type. But this type of equilibrium may not exist, even if performance monotonicity fails. You can get something that's totally different, which is monotonic and group blind. And I'll tell you why. What is crucial here, and I haven't told you this, I haven't given you the performance function or the training function, right? But implicit in my entire argument is that when people pool, when they pool to a lower training level, the productivity of that pool is not fallen so much that some tiny person who stays there is actually now more productive than the poor. That's a possibility. The possibility is that when people move, right, as more and more people invest, they're reducing the productivity or the performance of the pool. If they bring that performance down to a level where it is below the performance of low ability, high resource people who would have stayed, who would not have pooled, then you're going to now have a preference for those people who stay over those people in the pool. And so this kind of thing cannot be in equilibrium. So this is one type of equilibrium that can arise. And there's a second type of equilibrium that can arise if the underinvestment causes too much damage to productivity or performance. And I'll show you what that is. And once I show you what that is, that's essentially the whole argument. And everything else is elaboration with regard to continuous distributions and so on and so forth.
So this, I guess, conceptually I was thinking why fee is an independent function of A. I guess the idea is that the test or the training doesn't capture all dimensions of it.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And actually, selection policies of many institutions reveal a concern along those lines. Yeah. They reveal, even Oxford and Cambridge over the years, have started to think that the feeder schools, the Harrows and the Eatons, where everybody's going to Oxford, Cambridge, that maybe they would end up with a better pool if they just looked at places that don't even go to have A-levels, where people have to go complete it in a sixth form college or something. This is the UK case because I'm familiar with that system. But yeah, if you see a score and you say, look, this is really quite an achievement given the circumstances from which the person came from, you interpret it differently. That's why ability appears independently. On a more practical level, yeah, the idea is that training just isn't a sufficient statistic for future performance, that something else matters. And whatever it was that allowed you to get a higher training level given low resources will keep on helping you later in life. That's the idea. Yeah. I don't think that's a particularly controversial assumption. And I'm not really sure why it isn't more widespread in human capital. Or maybe it is. I think we can talk about it.
And also, R is exogenous, maybe that's people often endogenize R, which makes it monotonic in A, and so that.
So if you look at Glenn Lowry's paper, the Econometrica paper in 81, right? That's what he does. He has an intergenerational model where people invest, high R. He has, high ability and high resource. Resources and ability both affect your productivity. Exactly along the lines assumed here, except that in his case, productivity is observable. Right? Actually, this particular example I've shown you that productivity is observable here. It's not observable here because of the pooling, right? That effect is not there in Glenn's model, but yeah, it's an intergenerational model, and he looks at the ergodic distribution, long-run distribution of earnings, actually. And he talks about something called weak monotonicity and strong monotonicity, where conditional on people who are earning a lot, can you assume that people who are, is it true that people who are earning a lot are high ability people? Once you endogenize all this in an intergenerational context, it's a very good paper, right? And his answer is no, you can't. You will have some lower ability people who manage to make it to the top of the distribution. Of course, that effect is going to be washed away across generations. They'll go back down and so on. But at any given point in time, it's not the case that people with higher wages necessarily reflect higher ability. However, it is the case in expectation. So you have something what he calls weak monotonicity satisfied in the ergodic distribution, but not strong monotonicity. So that's a bit of a digression because I don't have a literature slide. That's an important precursor paper that looks at the full intergenerational dynamics where resources, your high earnings then give you the high resources to then invest in your children and so on. This is static in some sense, but it does have some ingredients that paper doesn't have. Okay, so I think this is just a recap, so we can just skip through. And the question is, this is an example I've shown you. How general this is, and I want to show you that it's general in the sense that it's generic. That there is a open set of parameter values for which you get this kind of thing. This is not a pathological example. It's not a knife edge case by any means. I think you can see that already. However, there's another generic set of outcomes, right? Okay. Okay, so let's. So what I'll do, the rest. So, Sean, do you want me to stop at 12:45 or stop earlier for discussion, or
And go to 12:45 class in Western.
Yeah, so let me go to 12:45, and I won't go to continuous case and all that. I just show you that other class of equilibrium and that stuff. Okay, so let's give you some notation. Everything I've done so far is just an extended example. So let I of T denote the selection probability conditional on training for group I. Okay, so this is a probability of selection, and the policy is strictly monotonic. If you select anybody with positive probability, at any training level, you select people who are above that with probability 1. That's your threshold rule. That's what people think of often as meritocracy. That obviously implies that if you're selecting with probability less than 1 at any training level, anybody with below training is selected with probability 0. Okay, policy is group blind if you apply the same standard to both groups. These two things are independent. I mean, you can have group blind that's monotonic, non-monotonic. Okay, define K1. So remember, K is a deep capacity. So define K1 as the proportion of the population with high ability and high resources. So this is the proportion of people in the population as a whole. So this is the 6% in my example. These are the people who will get the top score. You can infer that they have high ability and high resources. And K2 is the population of everybody who doesn't get the lowest score. So it's people who either get the top score or the next one or the one below that, right? So you know that they have either high ability or high resources or both, right? So K2 is obviously larger than this.
What the Qs are for?
Q are the proportion of the population that has high resources. So S1 is the proportion of the population belonging to group 1. That's general. Doesn't have to be 50%. Q1 is high resources. So let's look here. That's easier. So S1 is proportion in group 1. Q1 is people with high resources in group 1. This is the proportion of people with high ability in group 1. Right? So this times that tells you what people get the top score in group 1, and then this tells you for group 2, the other one together at the population as a whole.
Yeah, it's the same across.
F is the same. Yeah, that's what I call the axiom of anti-essentialism. The F is the same across the two groups. The only difference across the two groups is the Qs, and that's the resource distribution. That's correct.
And you still have 2 types.
What?
I mean, you still have 2 groups on it. No, not groups. The ability, AL and A.
Yeah. Sorry, this is all still 2 by 2. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. I can show you some things with continuous. If I have a couple of minutes, I'll show you that case. But this case is, I'm still in that world 2 by 2. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so think of K1. So K1 is obviously, in our example, it was 6%, and then K2 is much larger because it's everybody in the top 3. Okay, so if performance monotonicity holds, and this is a sort of trivial point that that came up earlier. If performance monotonicity holds, then they exist a monotonic in group blind equilibrium because higher training, you infer higher ability when you see higher training, and both the higher training and the higher ability are productive. So you're just going to choose monotonically in each group, and there's no reason why you shouldn't do it in a group blind way, actually, right? So in that case, your standard meritocratic equilibrium exists, right? The performance monotonicity. And if you're choosing monotonically, there's no incentive to undertake best. And this is true if either K is less than K1, so you're just taking less than 6%. You're taking that small sliver of the population, you just take the top. Or if K is bigger than K2, which means you have to dig right into the bottom of the distribution. Right? In that case, you've gone past that entire intermediate range. Right? So obviously your equilibrium will again be monotonic in group line, right? Because you're taking everybody, you don't even care. You know, your elite capacity is basically so large that you're taking a big chunk of the population and you're digging into the people with the lowest possible score, so everything in the middle doesn't matter. The interesting case is the intermediate case, right? What happens if elite capacity lies between these two things. Now I've shown you one type of equilibrium. So let me just define lambda I as the proportion with high ability in group I among those with intermediate test scores. So lambda I mean the formula is not terribly important. It's very standard. But basically, lambda I is just the proportion of people in group I who have high ability among those who have intermediate scores. Right? The two scores in the middle. And exactly as you saw in the example, right? As long as nobody underinvests, the proportion with high ability is going to be greater for the disadvantaged group. Okay? And even if you have underinvestment of the type we considered, that will still be the case. So lambda. So if group 1 is disadvantaged, then lambda 1 will be bigger than lambda 2. Right? In the example, we saw that this is completely general. It just follows from the point. So if performance monitoring fails, right? Suppose that performance monitoring fails, so you prefer to get somebody with high ability and the corresponding score, right? Even though the score, this training level is lower than that, right? Low ability, high score. The ability effect is strong enough that you still rather take that person, right? So performance monitoring fails. Yeah, even though low ability gets the highest score, you still prefer the people with high ability. Okay, in that case, there has to exist some mu. This is a sort of crucial parameter that really defines what kind of equilibrium you get. Okay. What is mu? So mu is a pool composition, right? It's a pool composition such that when a proportion mu, think of people underinvesting, and then you get this pool at the lower training level, and the lower training level is this one. It's the one that would, under truthful reporting, if you like, have high ability and low training. So as you get pooling, you worsen the quality of this pool. Right? Suppose that a proportion mu were originally at that training level, right? They had high ability and the corresponding resource level, high ability, low resource, and the corresponding training level. THL, high ability, low resource training level. So proportion mu are the incumbent population, and a proportion 1 minus mu are the entrant, if you like, the people who are underinvesting. You know, the smaller is mu, the worse the quality of the pool. Right? The more sort of pretenders there are coming in relative to the incumbents, if you think about it that way. Okay? And there's going to be some mu in 0, 1. There has to be under this, if performance monitoring fails, such that if people invest to such a point that the pool composition is mu incumbents and 1 minus mu entrants, that pool becomes equal in performance, expected performance, compared to the people who are shifting down. So the people with low ability and that particular score that corresponds to low ability high resources. Okay? So there has to exist some pool composition that achieves this equality. Okay? And the particular pool composition that does, we're calling it mu.
So that performance of AL THL would be less than AL TLH.
Yes, it must be. That's what means by training is productive. So people who are underinvesting, they could achieve this level, but they're not. They're achieving a lower level of training. So this is going to be strictly lower than that. That is correct. And this is by assumption here higher than that. Yeah, exactly. So there has to be some mu that equalizes. Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. Remember, this term is coming from people who could have achieved a higher training and chose not to. That is exactly right. But in choosing not to, they've lowered their own product. Yeah. Okay. So there must exist under the performance monitoring scales, there must exist some mu. And the nature of the equilibrium depends only on whether the mu is where mu lies in relation to lambda 1, lambda 2. Lambda 1, lambda 2 are the proportion hireability in groups 1 and 2 respectively. So either mu can be less than both lambda 1, lambda 2, or mu can be in the middle between those two, because lambda 1 is bigger than lambda 2, or mu can be above both of them. Those are your only three possibilities. And your structure of equilibrium depends only on which of these three cases prevails. And the case that I showed you is this case. The case that example fell into happened to be this case where mu is actually low, right? That it is lower than lambda 1, lambda 2. And in that case, basically, even if everybody pools, you still get a pool quality that is high, right? Because lambda 1 lambda 1, lambda 2 are higher than mu. So even if everybody pools, you're going to end up with a pool composition that is better than anybody who doesn't pool that.
That uses groups like disadvantage.
That induces non-blindness. That
You can differentiate between those two.
yeah, you do differentiate. That's the example that I showed you. Yeah, in this case when mu is below lambda 1, lambda 2, yes, you lose group blindness. But let me just show you what the equilibrium looks like. And the equilibrium has the following structure. Assuming, of course, that your K is between K1 and K2, your elite capacity, you don't just fill up your elite with the top people, and you don't need to reach all the way down to the bottom people, right? So you're in that intermediate range. Good. In that case, those people with the top score get selected with probability 1. Okay. The people with the second score get selected with probability 0. They get skipped over, right? This is without any underinvestment. Okay. No, I'm sorry. This is with underinvestment. Sorry, it gets skipped over, but nobody would be at that level because they would have all pooled. But yeah, but you still say, I won't take you if you take this training level. I won't take you. And either you take the people in the disadvantaged group and you fill up all your remaining slots. That's what I showed you. Or you take everybody in the disadvantaged group and you take positive on the advantage side. Either way, you don't have group blindness. Yeah. So what I showed you was this case where you take everybody at the top and you take people in the disadvantaged group at this score, right? But of course, if you expand the elite capacity, you're going to fill up your, you're going to take everybody, and then you need to take somebody from the advantage group in that range. And then if your elite capacity keeps going up, you'll go all the way down to the bottom and you'll exceed K2. Right? So that's the equilibrium basically that I showed you. The disadvantaged group is favored and you get underinvestment in both groups. Now, if you can commit to a policy, you can just achieve the exact same outcome just by committing to a weekly monotonic selection policy, but which reproduces exactly the selection probabilities over here. Remember that because you're taking positive over here, all of those people would have pulled down here. Okay. So you can replicate that through the commitment policy. I don't think I need to label that point. Yeah. Okay, what if mu is intermediate between these two? So now you'll get a different type of equilibrium. In this case, you take the people at the top, and then you take the people in the group 1. This is what I showed you. So what I showed you is consistent also with that, with mu in between these two. But if elite capacity rises, then you get something different. If elite capacity rises, so that you're taking everybody over here, right? Then you're going to select. Actually at both training levels from the advantage group, and your policy will be monotonic, and there's no incentive to underinvest. But actually, what's going on? You apply the same probability to these two groups, and you actually are indifferent between these two groups. Why are you indifferent between these two groups? Because people have underinvested to a degree that makes you indifferent. So you achieve that equality that mu is defined on the basis of. A certain proportion of people underinvest. At the point at which the pool quality is equal to the people who have not underinvested. The person doing the selection has become now indifferent between these two groups. They can now apply the same probability to the two groups, right? You select with equal probability, and those who underinvest and those who don't underinvest are equally well off. They face selection with the same probability. Now this could be broken, I guess, if people actually care about their own trading. Then underinvestment is actually personally costly. Then you'll get something slightly different. But I'm just assuming that underinvestment itself is not costly. It's costly to the person doing the selection, not necessarily to the person who's doing the underinvestment. Anyway, so that's what you get if mu is intermediate. What happens if mu is large, right? It's above lambda 1, lambda 2. Then you get monotonic group line selection. Right? So that's also a generic possibility in this model. And basically what that does is that in both groups you go down to a point at which the performance is equalized across those two training levels. Same properties apply to selection, and there's no performance difference between the two intermediate training levels, right? In expectation. And in this case, you do it to both groups. There's no advantage to there's no preference for the disadvantaged group. You apply. It's interesting. Although the disadvantaged group has a higher proportion of people who are high ability, they don't get the probability here is not higher than the probability here. Right? It's in fact the same. Why is it the same? Because you've got a different number of people pooling in each group. In each group, they're pooling to the point at which they're equalizing the performance of the pool to the people who are staying at the second highest training level, TLH. And of course, the performance of people at TLH is common to both groups. So the two pools in the two groups actually end up being equally productive. So even though there's more high ability types among those intermediate training levels, that's sort of advantage to the disadvantaged group is undone by the degree to which the two groups are pooling. So this is actually pretty close to the standard conception of meritocracy. You're applying the same standard to the two groups, and it's monotonic, but it's not strictly monotonic. It's weakly monotonic. And people are making adjustments to make you different, basically. So those are the possibilities, and the one I focused on in the example was the one that I thought was most interesting. But these are the possibilities.
So if supposing training is costly.
Training is costly. That's what resources are. That's training is definitely costly. That's why resources affect training.
Yes, but then wouldn't I be willing to accept the more probability of being selected in return for not having to use up those resources in training?
Yes. So the question, yeah. The question, what you're saying is that suppose that underinvestment saves me resources.
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, exactly. So here I'm assuming that your underinvestment is actually not saving you your resources, but you might want to think of a case where you save resources, and so therefore that gives you the opposite effect to what I previously
So
suggested.
that case, wouldn't the equilibrium involve different probabilities
It could.
in order to compensate for that between the training levels?
It could. I haven't looked at it. It's an interesting possibility. But that's the opposite of what I was thinking. What I was thinking is that the underinvestment actually hurts you. But you're saying underinvestment actually helps you because it saves resources. Yeah. Which you can then consume on something else. Yeah. Both those cases are. Yeah. Both those cases are relevant.
I feel a little uncomfortable about the underinvestment aspect of it. That this being driven by underinvestment.
Yeah.
I mean, the general notion, is, there seems to be a more robust notion as to why you shouldn't be monotonic in this thing, or you should not be group blind, I should say. The group blindness aspect comes from the, from the fact that there is underinvestment in the pool and so on. But generally speaking, if you see a person from a disadvantaged background doing well, your posterior beliefs about this person should be higher, and that should not in some way depend on whether people are underinvested.
Yeah, I agree with you.
And I don't see people underinvested. People don't know their own ability.
Yeah, I agree with you on all those counts. And let me just say two things about that. One is that the reason why the pooling and the under-investment is playing a role here is because otherwise everything's observable. It's a 2-by-2 case. Once you have continuous ability distributions, really everything I've said to you just goes through even without under-investment. Actually, that is true. But the other thing that I want to point out is that I don't want us to focus on the under-investment equilibrium at all. The under-investment equilibrium is a stepping stone to the commitment policy, which is monotonic. It's weakly monotonic, and basically what you do is you achieve what you would have with the under-investment equilibrium by removing any incentive to under-invest. And that to me is the most plausible version of this discrete model. It's not the one where there's actual equilibrium under-investment. It is where that's a sort of conceptual stepping stone to the commitment case.
Or if you just had a probabilistic model in which your training level is, I mean, you couldn't infer everything. You couldn't infer ability directly from training, but you just had some noise that somebody took an exam back to, etc.
Yeah, you could do it with noise, or you could do it with the continuous ability distribution, which we have in the paper. But your discomfort with the underinvestment equilibrium, I share actually. I share. It's not really plausible, but to me it's a sort of conceptual stepping stone. It's the commitment case. It's this case that I think is really the relevant one, even in this case. That one. There's no underinvestment here. But there is a departure from good lines. That's the case that I think.
But just assuming that there is no underinvestment directly, I mean, I don't see people. Everybody does the best they can.
Then in this particular model, then you're here where you get group line and you get non-monotonicity. But the problem with that is you don't really get the non-monotonicity either.
No,
but you do actually in some way. In some indirect. The Texas 10% is non-monotonic. Yeah.
Non-group likeness also just, the basic intuition is that if I see a person from a disadvantaged background doing well, my posterior and his or her ability should be much higher. I mean, does it actually have to rest on some story of this, that? I don't know. I mean, it's actually more robust. Than
the question is that why do you care about that posterior? You care about that posterior because that ability is providing you something valuable over and above the score. And that's coming into the performance function. That's exactly why ability affects your score and subsequent performance, why it appears both directly and indirectly. So exactly your reasoning, so yeah, you're right. You see somebody from a disadvantaged background and you say, okay, they got the same score as this other person who's had all the resources poured into their education since the age of whatever, right? This person must have high ability. But why do you care? You care because you think that there's something they can do for you, right?
I totally believe that. In fact, I would say that, for instance, the ISI entrance test or that training, doing well on that thing, I care nothing about it. I only care about the student's ability insofar as the training gives me a signal. I don't really care about training per se or in itself, right? And for most education, institution, elite institutions and so on, where you look at scores, I would say that you care only. I mean, I'm happy that there's a benchmark. No, So this performance non-monotonicity is particularly striking in, and you can say that I care only about ability, I don't care about training. And I only want to select. And the idea that
then there would be no efficiency loss from underinvestment. But I mean that's Spence basically, right? That you only care about ability, but the high ability people are able to get a higher score at lower cost.
No, they don't have risk of it. When you for instance, can't go to coaching school and so on and so forth. But because of that, since the scores are this thing, but I look at their background and the fact that they didn't go to a coaching school tells me something about their ability. So I'm saying that that seems to be an intuition.
I think you're right that it's more robust than this particular model. That's right. I think that's right. I think one could if that were the only point one were trying to make, then I think one could do it in a very straightforward way.
But that's a very, if you're interested in this point, then it had better survive productive training. Because unproductive training is an extreme case.
I'm just thinking of, entrance tests. Frankly, I mean, what that I have in mind is, the JEE, the ISI entrance test, etc., etc. Should you, the reservation policy, whatever, they're all based on these ideas that, the whole debate is whether one should just be completely blind and just look at sports.
Yeah, but
And that's
what many countries do, right? And many institutions
The
do.
point is, I think that what you're saying, this point is that even if training is productive, and by the way, I think that it is, the point is you may be studying for an exam, but the way that you're learning something is. So
Let me put it this way, you see.
your incentives will be somewhat distorted by the fact that you're just trying to get those marks and you don't really care what you're learning about. But still, you're learning something useful.
Yeah.
And given that's the case, and that therefore you're more productive, does the ability signal still matter enough that you want to pick that person despite the fact that they have a loss?
Yeah. Let me put it this way. Don't look at people with equal scores. Look at people with scores that are close. Okay. You've got an advantaged person and somebody who's disadvantaged, right? And the disadvantaged person has a somewhat lower score. And you say, hey, my posterior tells me that I should pick the disadvantaged person, even though they have a somewhat lower score.
Yes.
Because they're going to have high ability and that's going to compensate for that lower score. They're going to do more for me. Okay. Now extend this example and take lower and lower and lower and lower scores. At some point, you're going to say, okay, I still think that this person has high ability, but they're just not going to make it in my program.
Yeah, sure.
That's the productiveness of training. That's the role that productiveness of training is playing.
No, I don't dispute that. I'm just, the underinvestment story.
I agree. I'm uncomfortable with it also. I'm uncomfortable. To me, I see it as a conceptual stepping stone to this commitment to equilibrium, right? But you don't need it in the continuous case, right? I should stop, but you don't need it. Once you have garbling of the signal, then you don't need these things. Right? No need these things. You don't need these things. That's right. And that was actually the original way we wrote this paper. I'm going to stick to it. It's basically what happens with and let me just show you two pictures. I mean, if you don't mind, so if I just go through. Basically, what happens is that suppose that you've got two resource levels, but continuous ability distribution. Then basically there's some training level which you cannot reach unless you have a higher resource. So people above that training level are only people who are have high resource, and of course they're mostly from the advantage group, but there's going to be some from the disadvantage group. Okay, if your lead capacity is very low, you're just going to pick that top, that yellow little band over there. You have exactly threshold policy. Pick a training level, pick everybody above it. You get mostly people from the advantage group, but you'll get some from the disadvantage. Monotonic group line selection. Okay. Suppose your lead capacity right, and this is your expected productivity conditional on group membership. Disadvantage group is blue, advantage group is red. So at any given training level, exactly what you said, right? In the continuous case, at any given training level, your expected productivity is higher than the disadvantage group. This is your basic assumption. Okay, but that's only for people below this threshold level of training, which you can achieve. So you can achieve these training levels with high or low resources, and because the people have low resources and expectation, they end up with higher expected productivity because ability matters independently. Okay, that's the situation. If the lead capacity goes up, you still have a threshold score here. You take everybody at the top. Now you take a small band of people from the disadvantaged group in addition to them, and you leave out the people in the middle of it. There's no under-investment here. This is just everybody's reporting truthfully, if you like, to take the, so to speak. Okay, there's achieving the highest training level that they can achieve. Okay. Now the lead capacity goes up even further. Now you take some people from both groups. There's a training level. There's a set of training levels where you take people from both groups. There's a set of training levels below that where you only take from disadvantage. And then of course you take the people at the top. Okay, but it's still non-monotonic. Okay. The lead capacity rises further. You're still favoring the disadvantaged group, but now it's monotonic. Now you have a threshold for disadvantage and a higher threshold for the advantage. It's very intuitive actually. Yeah. And that's really what you get in the continuous case. You don't need to have any under-investment.
Yeah, that's what I would have thought.
Yeah. So that's actually, yeah. And if you think that that's worth emphasizing more, then we should rewrite the paper a bit differently. But that comes through without any under-investment from the continuous case. Yeah.
So the non-monopolicity appears in the middle range of the.
Yeah, middle range value capacity, just like it does in the discrete model. Yeah. And then here you get monotonicity, but different thresholds. Not you get monotonicity, but you lose group lines. And finally, if you look at representation, this is a continuous model. Basically, if the lead capacity goes to 1, you take everybody, then obviously, you're under. This is a representation of the disadvantaged group. 1 means that there's equal representation. Obviously, if you take everybody, you're going to get equal representation, right? If your lead capacity is very small, then you take. I'm sorry, I haven't had time to define all these betas and stuff like that. It just depends on how much ability matters for subsequent performance relative to training, right? That's the thing. But even here, in the continuous model, you can get over-representation of the disadvantaged group for certain values of the lead capacity, even though they're really disadvantaged. And that's because, as your lead capacity rises, you're really selecting favorably from that group, right? And this effect, I think, is not really okay. Maybe it's empirically not relevant. I don't know. But the fact that it can happen means that. Let me just go to my concluding slide. The fact that it can happen means that the usual framing of the problem, from direction, reservations, whatever, as a trade-off between performance and representativeness is misleading. You can have all kinds of different representativeness outcomes, even if you don't even care about representativeness. All you care about is performance. So you can't infer from an organization exercising what appears to be favoritism that they actually care about the group. Because they're just doing it based on performance motives. That's really part of the issue. And to finish, I just want to mention that we're not arguing in this paper that meritocracy is desirable as a standard. We're trying to understand what it implies in terms of selection policies. And there may be lots of reasons why you don't want to do that. This is Michael Gannon's book that supposedly first introduced the term meritocracy in 1956. But you've got a huge number of books recently about meritocracy. It's like one of the most commonly discussed things in books. All of them are using the same language: the tyranny of meritocracy, the myth of meritocracy, the whatever. Aristocracy of talent is basically going back to Jefferson, and so on. And Bob Frank's book is very, very interesting. Actually, it's the only economist in this group. But basically, one argument which Michael Sandel makes, and many of the other people also make, is that you may not want meritocracy. This is my last point. I don't know, but I've tested your patience too much already. But this is an important point. One of the points Michael Sandel makes is that before meritocracy became like almost a religious principle that societies try to adopt and follow, there was a lot of inequality in society. There was this old style, you acquired your position through a prescription. It was your wealth and birth that affected your thing. And so if you didn't get those positions, you felt that life is unfair, that you were, that society is really unfair to you, and it's very bad, and it's very unfortunate. But you didn't blame yourself. And one of the points that Sandel makes is that one of the most corrosive things about meritocracy as a governing ideology is that people who don't make it are basically told that they are to blame. And that's an interesting point, actually. So I just wanted to emphasize, it's basically that not only, are you going to not have wealth and prestige and status, but you deserve it. And so actually very interesting. This book is actually a mixture of sociology and science fiction. The book that introduced meritocracy, he looks at 2033. The book is set in 2033 or something like that, right? He's writing in 1956. And basically he describes how meritocracy grows as a system. Historically, that's the sociology part. And then eventually is overthrown by a populist revolt because people just, say to hell with this, don't want the system. And it's kind of echoed in some of the more recent books as well. So let me stop there. It's not really part of the point, but I don't want to be saying that meritocracy is good. It is what it is.
Before we go, I just want to make one remark that I heard one of the specific Sweden a few years ago.
Yeah.
So somebody was saying that one of the problems that this is a real problem in Sweden because of the relatively very egalitarian country, and the Swedish social democracy has been around in power for 80 years or something. One of the issues with that is that whereas in the 30s and 40s, if you were, blue collar worker, not much money, and you knew that was because of your social class, right? It had nothing to do with you as a person.
Yeah.
But now, 80 years later, when you know, the entire working class has had all the opportunities that it has had in Sweden.
Yeah.
Now, if you are not, you know, a university professor or successful in some conventional way, then you are kind of made to see that, well, that's up, you know, now the state has done everything for you. Right, that's your fault.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, but
Yeah, that's good. We're getting away from economics, but yeah.